In the troglodyte world of the war on the Western Front, what weapons came to define how that war developed and how it was fought? In this episode, we look at 5 weapons of trench warfare. Trench warfare is not just an essential part of our understanding of the First World War, it's very much at the heart of what that war, particularly on the Western Front, was all about. And we've discussed various aspects of trench warfare in previous episodes of the podcast, but I thought it was time to look at some of the specific weapons connected to it, from existing ones found in the British Army in 1914 through to those developed because of trench warfare, and at the end perhaps look at a surprising weapon of the First World War connected to trench warfare too. And what we're going to do is we're going to take 5 examples. There are many types of weapons that we could look at in this, but to make this an easily understandable and digestible podcast, we'll use 5 examples. And what we'll also do is focus on the British and Commonwealth experience of trench warfare, because each different nation, the French, the Germans, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russians on the Eastern Front, they all had different approaches to how they adapted to the arrival and then development of trench warfare. And perhaps it will be a good reason to go back to this subject and look at it from the perspective of some of those nations as well. But of course, we won't fail to talk about some of those nations as we discuss this from that British perspective. We can't see the British and Commonwealth, the Empire forces, in isolation. But before we begin, let's just have a kind of basic background to trench warfare. When the armies of Europe went to war in 1914, they were prepared for war, just not the kind of war that the Great War would rapidly turn into. They were prepared for a war of movement, with troops advancing over open ground, using the landscape to attack or defend, but an army and facing an army that would be about manoeuvre, not being in a static position. And in the first months of the war, that's pretty much what the war was about. In those opening battles on the French and Belgian and German borders, the battles of the frontiers, it was very much open warfare. And even when the British Expeditionary Force arrived and moved up into northern France and then into Belgium and fought at Mons, they were defending a position, a natural barrier, the Mons-Condé Canal, but their intention was not to stay there forever. And in some of the later battles on the Marne and the Aisne, they too experienced some of this open warfare along the lines of what they'd trained for in the years before the Great War. But this war of movement came to an end with the failure of the Schlieffen Plan to capture Paris in September of 1914, and then the failure of the so-called race to the sea as the German army swept towards the Channel coast in northern France and Flanders. It led to an impasse, a stalemate on the battlefield, and that is when both sides begin to dig in. The very first trenches were on the Aisne, with the stalemate that ensued after the Battle of the Marne, but on a much wider scale, from Belgium down into northern and across to eastern France, the Germans and the French and the British and the Belgians begin to dig in along what becomes known, and it's a name coined by the Germans, it becomes known as the Western Front. And that Western Front, by the early part of 1915, stretches from the Belgian coast down through what is remaining of Belgian soil not occupied by German soldiers into northern France, across to eastern France, and then ending on the borders of Switzerland. 450 miles of trenches which then develop over the course of the next few years, and all sides in this war spend much of the rest of the conflict trying to break this stalemate. It is essentially, and this is a key to understanding it, a huge siege war along the lines of a kind of medieval siege, but on a much, much bigger and unprecedented scale, with millions of men locked along these 450 miles of trenches from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border. And during the 4 years of that conflict, armies that had gone to war to fight a mobile war have to then adapt to this static warfare and come up with ideas and indeed weapons to try and break it. And if you want to discover more about the war, the nature of the static part of the Western Front, trench warfare on the Western Front, there are some previous episodes of the podcast. But it's the weapons of that trench warfare that we're going to look at now. So let's go to our first of the 5 weapons that we're going to discuss in this podcast. The first of the weapons that we're going to discuss in the context of trench warfare is a weapon that already existed when the world went to war in 1914 and when the British Expeditionary Force was formed to be dispatched to France in August of that year. And that weapon is the handgun. Now, the handgun is not a weapon that was invented for the First World War. It has a long history over many centuries before 1914, and every army in the world has some of the latest handguns. It's a type of weapon that has gone from a flintlock pistol through to modern revolvers and even automatic pistols by 1914. And in terms of the British Army, who had handguns when they went to war? Now, a sidearm, a handgun, a pistol, a revolver is something that is not carried in 1914 by everyone. Principally in the British Army, in the BEF, it's mainly officers that have it. Not just officers, but mainly officers. Some NCOs, non-commissioned officers, have them if they have specific tasks where they can't carry a rifle. So there were some units in the Royal Engineers, for example, where they were doing specific tasks, and although they had rifles that they could draw on in a day-to-day basis, they would have a handgun in a holster on a belt. And you see that in contemporary pictures. The next kind of pecking order of soldiers would be warrant officers, so these would be company sergeant majors, company quartermaster sergeants, and then the regimental level of that, regimental sergeant major and the RQMS. They would also have sidearms because they were men who were in command, and although there are photographs of RSMs with Lee Enfield rifles in their hand, generally they carried a sidearm. But in terms of ordinary private soldiers, the vast majority of them never went anywhere near in 1914 that kind of weapon. They were either in units where they had specific tools or equipment to do their task, or if they were in the infantry, they had a short magazine, Lee Enfield. Now, a sidearm was a weapon which you could not engage an enemy over any great distance. You're looking at tens of yards to be able to accurately shoot at someone with a pistol or a revolver, rather than hundreds of yards as you would be with a rifle, or thousands of yards if it was a machine gun, particularly if it was being fired indirectly. So perhaps in the kind of mindset of the British Army that went to war in 1914, thinking that they were going to fight a mobile war, a sidearm would be something that probably you might consider to be there for your protection and for your status, particularly as an officer, rather than a weapon that you would necessarily wield in any great purpose on a battlefield. Now, already in 1914, in some of those early engagements, pistols did become incredibly important. I remember reading the personal diary of a machine gun officer who fought in the First Battle of Ypres in October and November of 1914, and he engaged the enemy with his machine guns. They ran out of ammunition. They even ran out of ammunition for the rifles that they had as part of their machine gun section. He was firing away with his pistol, and he too ran out of ammo, and he ended up throwing the pistol at the Germans to try and knock away a particularly big Prussian guardsman who was coming towards him. But this kind of experience was largely accidental, and it was only once both sides dug in and trench warfare became, in a word I use very often in this podcast, this troglodyte world where men lived in the close confines of trenches, the apparent usefulness of having a sidearm in an enclosed space where when you were in a trench fighting the enemy, you were going to be at very close quarters, the usefulness of having a sidearm, pistol, revolver, this was now obvious to those who were on the battlefields, and those officers who had gone to war with them suddenly realised perhaps how lucky they were to have these weapons, particularly when they were in attacks, when they were shooting at the enemy at close quarters, and then, as we've said, got into their trench systems. Now, in terms of the ownership of these handguns, these sidearms, in terms of officers, these were their personal possessions. They were not weapons issued to them by the War Office. Officers were given a kit allowance before and during the Great War from which they could buy their kit, their uniform, their Sam Browne, their sword, all this kind of stuff. And there were tailor shops across Britain where you could go into as a newly commissioned officer to have your uniform made, and your corduroy breeches, salmon pink was one of the favourite colours, have all these kind of things made for you. And as part of that, you could buy your own handgun. Now, the standard kind of military caliber for handguns at this time was .455 caliber. Webley made a handgun of this nature, and a lot of officers had that. But there was also a Colt handgun made by the Colt Armament Company, and this was also a popular weapon both before and during the Great War. They were pretty heavy sidearms. And to give you a bit of an example, one of the veterans I knew, and I think I've told this story in the podcast before, but Leslie Lovegrove was an officer in the South Lancashire Regiment. He was commissioned aged 18. Later on in the conflict, he went to a shop, bought his uniform. I've got photographs of him. He looks quite smart, if not very, very young as an officer, as a young second lieutenant. But the issue he had is when he bought his sidearm, he was so thin and so weak, really, that he couldn't hold it properly. He couldn't hold the gun in one hand on a pistol range and shoot it. He had to use both hands, and the first time he pulled the trigger with a live round in there, it knocked him off his feet. And he made a decision that he wasn't going to fire this thing again. And he told me that every time he went over into action with this in his hand, and he felt that he had to have it in his hand to impress the men around him, it was never loaded, because he was fearful of what would happen if he did pull the trigger under combat conditions. Conversely, some of the other officers that I interviewed never left their positions without their handgun loaded and ready in a holster on their Sam Browne or on their belt, whatever kind of belt they were carrying. Later on in the war, officers started to wear webbing gear, and special types of holsters were then adapted so that they could have those on there. But they felt, and Malcolm Vivian, a veteran that I've often mentioned on this podcast, is a good example of this. He'd seen in 1916, when he was up in the Montio-Bois sector north of Gomacourt, he'd been in a forward observation post spotting for his guns, and he'd seen off across to his right the Germans had raided the forward trenches there and got into those trenches, and he realised how beneficial it was to have a sidearm close at hand that he could draw on in case those Germans suddenly came round the traverse of the trench and he was confronted by a raiding party. He was a keen sportsman. He'd played rugby in Wales before the First World War. It was kind of a family tradition, and he was a lot fitter than Leslie Lovegrove, and he had absolutely no problem whatsoever in wielding the Colt sidearm that he carried with him. That was his preferred weapon rather than a Webley. Now, going back to Leslie Lovegrove's problem in actually holding a big sidearm like a Webley or a Colt or whatever it was, it became a fashion, particularly in 1915 when you read some of the memoirs, for officers who presumably had the same kind of problems to buy automatic pistols, often very small automatic pistols, which were very small caliber, some of them as small as 6mm. I've seen some examples of this. And that meant there was a very small bullet in there. Now, it was a compact firearm that you could easily carry and was easy to fire, not massive amount of recoil. So even the weediest of officers were able to use this, but there was a downside, and that was the hitting power of the bullet, the round that was being fired from this pistol. Sure, you could fire off a lot of shots. Sure, it was easy to operate and not very heavy, but the bullet, when it struck an enemy soldier in front of you, wouldn't necessarily kill him or even knock him off his feet. And that was the thing about the Webleys. They were often called man stoppers. The power of that .455 cartridge was enough to blow a soldier off his feet if he was hit by it at close range. With these small caliber pistols, there's an account, I think in Robert Graves' Goodbye to All That, where an officer empties an entire magazine into a large Bavarian soldier and he keeps running at that officer. So you see a move away from those smaller caliber pistols back towards the larger firearms as the war progresses. So initially, again, as the war moves into trench warfare, it is largely officers that have these sidearms, but as it's quite clear that trench warfare is something that is not a novelty, it's not just going to disappear, more and more ordinary soldiers have access to these weapons as well, particularly as other weapon systems change and are used in greater numbers. So the advent of the importance of machine guns results in the creation of battalion machine gun sections that existed before the war, but with larger numbers of men in them, and then eventually that leads to the creation of the machine gun corps with brigade machine gun companies, and within the infantry battalions, the creation of Lewis gun sections to retain automatic weapons that can be used at battalion level. Now again, all of these weapons are heavy, and most of the men operating them cannot carry a rifle, so more and more of these ordinary soldiers, some of them just privates, are carrying sidearms. And in this case, they're not ones that they've had to go out and buy themselves because they're ordinary soldiers, they don't get a kit allowance, and they're only of very modest means. So the War Office issues them. So the War Office buys more and more handguns as the war goes on because there is a need for them amongst the rank and file of the army as the nature of the war changes. And again, kind of drawing on a bit of veteran testimony for this, and I've mentioned him again many times in this podcast, George Butler. Now, he was a sergeant, but he'd been a corporal in the machine gun corps before that, and he was part of the main team actually firing and operating a Vickers machine gun, so he carried a sidearm, particularly when he was number one on the gun. So he carried the machine gun, so he couldn't carry a Lee Enfield as well as that. So he had a firearm, sidearm on his leather belt. He liked using a leather belt with an open top leather holster, which had a little flap to secure the Webley that he kept in there. And he would often, when he spoke about this, he would talk about using it cowboy style, whipping it out cowboy style. And he went to the range and he learned to shoot in the traditional way of how these men were taught to shoot sidearms. But he also liked the idea of being able to react quickly with a sidearm. He felt that was the benefit of it, that you could just flip that little catch, pull out the weapon, and instantly go into action with it. And with a machine gun team, if they were suddenly surrounded in a counterattack, they may not be able to operate the gun at close range, and they may be changing belts as the enemy coming towards them, so at least he had that to fall back on. And another machine gunner, George Coppard, who wrote With a Machine Gun to Cambrai, talks about his experience with sidearms and how they trained with them. And at one stage he talks about lining up the different belligerents' helmets and then firing their sidearms into it to see which was the better helmet. I think in his book he says it was the British helmet, although I think that is still something that is debated to this day. But what I do remember with Coppard's account is that he talks about on one instance on the Somme, I think in October 1916, he dropped his Webley when they were coming out of the line. It just got knocked out of his holster, and he didn't see it in the darkness, and he realised that he was responsible for it, and the War Office, the army, were going to come after him financially for having lost this weapon. So he was able to make up some tale to get away with that. But that was another kind of element of this, another layer of this, and that while soldiers, ordinary soldiers, were suddenly privileged to be given what was essentially, before the war, an officer's weapon, it came with some degree of responsibility as well. And as the war progresses and more new units are brought in, the issue of sidearms to ordinary soldiers grows. Dispatch riders, Donnars, they have them in the Royal Engineers, signallers in the Royal Flying Corps that were attached to artillery units. Again, I interviewed several veterans who were RFC men, who were trained signallers, and then were attached to Royal Field Artillery or Royal Garrison Artillery units as signallers, because the life of a signaller was pretty short on the Western Front. They carried sidearms. Men who served in the tanks, whether that was the Machine Gun Corps at the very beginning and later with the formation of the Tank Corps in 1917, they had sidearms. And if you look at contemporary images of the First World War, you see the instance and use of sidearms amongst ordinary soldiers very, very apparent within that archive of images that we have from the First World War. But in terms of fighting in trenches, that is when weapons like this really came into their own. Because if you're fighting in the close confines of a trench, whether that's raiding an enemy position or whether they're attacking you and you've got to defend your position, having a weapon that is not that big that you can move around in your battle space to shoot at the enemy with, and it's pretty accurate and you're shooting at close range anyway, these are all the advantages of carrying this type of firearm when you're on a battlefield. And with the arrival of the American Expeditionary Force in 1917, and particularly later in that year when British units begin to train AEF battalions and regiments and units in what they have learned from trench warfare, and no doubt discuss the importance and the usefulness of sidearms, this is an army they're facing now, the American army, where the instance of ordinary soldiers having sidearms is much, much greater. And one of the weapons that the Americans bring with them in 1917 is the 1911 Colt automatic pistol. Now, as soon as American soldiers meet British and Empire soldiers, you see a degree of equipment going in both directions, particularly amongst those units like the 27th New York and the 30th Tennessee Division, who end up fighting within the British Expeditionary Force itself. So if we look at wartime photographs, these images of the Great War are such an important part of our understanding of how kit and equipment was used, because we're seeing it used to its full purpose on the battlefield in these images captured by official photographers. But not just official photographers, because there's an archive of images taken in the village of Vignacourt. These were photographs taken behind the lines by a French civilian photographer. And amongst those, we've got examples of British soldiers in 1918 also carrying Colt automatic pistols. So there was an instance of British and Empire soldiers. And one or two accounts of Canadians in 1918 refer to the use of that type of weapon as well. So handguns, a weapon that really was a kind of officer status weapon in 1914, is a weapon that proves its usefulness in the close confines, that troglodyte nature of trench warfare in the First World War, and is a weapon that becomes not an exclusive weapon for those who were gentlemen or temporary gentlemen, but for a wide variety of soldiers in different units during those 4 years of the Great War. So the handgun, an important weapon of the trench war. Our next weapon of trench warfare is also one that did exist in 1914, but I don't believe any British Army unit went to war with it. And that weapon is the hand grenade. Hand grenades had been developed before the First World War. The British had some in their arsenals. They had what kind of looks like a club with a metal fixture on the top, which is the detonator, with a metal band around it, which then blows apart when the grenade explodes, causing some shrapnel damage. That's a #1 Mark II grenade. There's also what was called the Mexican grenade. It had been made for the Mexican government before the war. They'd not actually been delivered to the Mexican government, so those kind of grenades were kept back for the British Army once the war became static. But when the BEF marched off to France in August 1914, I don't think in any of their stores, in any of their equipment, in any of the battalion gear that was taken across as part of the BEF, grenades were not a part of it. Because again, they're close quarter weapons, and you're not going to be using those in open warfare. So the army could not see any sense at all in taking that kind of kit with them. So if we look at the battles of Mons, of Le Cateau, on the Marne and the Aisne, and the First Battle of Ypres, when we read the accounts, contemporary accounts, and look at war diaries, and read personal accounts of those that were there, I don't think we'll find any reference at all to the use of hand grenades. It's only once the war becomes static that you see those weapons emerging. Now, I suspect that the usefulness of them became apparent because the Germans had them in great numbers, and they did take them to war. There's a whole variety of German grenades that, again, as soon as the war became static, British soldiers would have been on the receiving end of those. And I think then commanders, perhaps aware that there were stockpiles of #1 Mark II grenades and Mexican grenades back at depots or munition stores in Britain somewhere, then put in requests for them to be sent out. But in the meantime, what soldiers begin to do, and this is mentioned in, again, quite a few war diaries, particularly within the Indian Corps down around Givenchy and Festubert and places like that, and also in some of the units up in Flanders, you see the development and use of so-called jam tin bombs. So a jam tin bomb is exactly what it says on the tin, quite literally. It is a jam tin, so it's had Tickler's plum and apple jam in it. The soldiers scoff that down, and it's left a metal container with a lid. And what soldiers began to do was to put gun cotton charges in there with wick fuses and perhaps a little bit of shrapnel in there to give it an extra punch. And then they would make this, seal the lid so mud and the elements didn't get in there amongst the gun cotton, tamper the fuse so it was 5 or 6 seconds, something like that, and then light it and then chuck it at the enemy. And if you look at some of the early illustrations and read some of the early accounts, they developed catapult weapons to fire these jam tin bombs across a greater distance over no man's land. So what you're seeing in that 1914-15 period is the first implementation of hand grenades, improvised ones at this stage, and then improvising weapons to not just throw them, but to propel them across the battlefield. And this is something that continues throughout the rest of the war on a much more scientific basis, of course. But eventually, those #1 Mark II and the Mexican grenades and some other designs of grenades do arrive on the battlefields. And I remember over many years of walking the battlefields of Loos, of Festubert, of Neuve-Chapelle, you often found these very rare, unusual designs of grenades as part of the Iron Harvest, testifying to the use of some of those primitive models of hand grenade that the British Army had in that early period of the conflict. And aside from making the jam tin bombs out of the tins of plum and apple jam or whatever kind of jam it was, they also began to manufacture steel hand grenades in France itself. So an engineer officer called Major Batty managed to get hold of a steel foundry in Bethune, design a very basic bomb, which was a metal canister that had black powder inside with a little wooden stopper at the top and a wick fuse. And he had the canisters made in this steel factory in Bethune, shipped to the front line where the charge and then the fuse would be put in and they would be used on the battlefield. They're about the size of an average hand. They're not a massive charge inside, but there was enough powder in there to make them a lethal weapon at close quarters, because what they realised with grenades, a bit like the use of the handguns, in the close quarters nature of trenches, when an explosion took place, it would have a much more deadly effect because it was in a confined space. So rather than throw a grenade to somebody in a field where the blast would be spread around, in a trench the blast would be confined and do much more damage to the enemy. So that's the importance really of this type of weapon in what became the cutting edge of warfare in 1914-18, the experience of warfare in the trenches. So the Batty bomb becomes another design, but it's clear that all these kind of improvised grenades and the early grenades, they're not good enough. So the War Office develops a number 5 grenade in 1915, and the Battle of Loos is the first battle on the Western Front in which these bombs are issued on a large basis, not so that every soldier has one at that stage, but they're beginning to be issued. And this is a much more powerful grenade with amatol explosive inside it, very powerful explosive, not to be confused with ammonol, which is the lifting explosive used by the tunnellers. This is a blasting explosive, and in the grenade, it blows the grenade apart. The grenade is cast in steel in this kind of pineapple configuration, so that when it blows apart, it breaks up into small fragments, and those small fragments will be tossed around as well as the explosion taking place. And what you find is when the Mills grenades begin to be used, they are deadly. They have a big charge in them and a powerful charge, and that results in these metal fragments being tossed around in every direction and killing and wounding everyone that they come into contact with. And when you compare them to some of the German grenades that largely use the kind of black powder explosive, one of the veterans that I interviewed, Frank Plum in the Suffolk Regiment, he had a German stick grenade land at his feet at Arras in 1917, and it blew him out of the trench and badly wounded his lower abdomen and his legs, but it didn't kill him. If that had been a Mills grenade landed at his feet, he'd have been killed instantly by the combination of the blast and the fragments, the shrapnel from the grenade when it went off. So from the time of the Battle of Loos onwards, and as you approach the period of the Battle of the Somme in 1916, these number 5 Mills hand grenades become the most important bomb, as the British call it, and they refer to men using grenades as bombers. And in an infantry battalion, the group of men brought together to act as bombers are called the bombing section, commanded by a bombing officer. And not just them, they're the ones who are particularly good at throwing grenades and using grenades and become the kind of shock troops of the bombers within a battalion. But every man is trained to use this because in big attacks, most soldiers go over the top with 2 grenades, one in each tunic pocket. So everyone has to know how to use them. And the number 5 grenade is quite simple to use. It's got a little cap on the bottom that you unscrew to put the detonator in, then you screw it back up again. Then it's got a handle, a spoon that you wrap your fingers over, and then a pin that you pull out that then releases that spoon. And as soon as you release your hand, the spoon flies off, and 5.5 seconds later, the grenade explodes. Now, in that time, having pulled the pin out and released the spoon, you've got to chuck it. And that's the bit that soldiers have to be trained to do. And there are accidents. Again, when you read the accounts of what were called bombing schools, which soldiers are sent to train on this kind of kit, they do have accidents where soldiers forget the process of pulling the pin out, releasing the lever and throwing the grenade, or throwing it, that it hits something and drops back into the position that they're throwing it from. So it's not without accident because it is a new weapon. It's the kind of kit that none of these soldiers have been trained on when they're in Britain, particularly in the early period of the war. And just like the armies adapting to trench warfare, the soldiers have to adapt to this new type of weaponry, which is why training was so important in the Great War, and something that is largely forgotten, how much training took place continuously on the battlefield throughout 4 years of the conflict. If soldiers weren't trained to use these things, they're just a lump of metal on the battlefield, which is pretty useless. They have to know how to use them. And grenades become crucially important in trench raids. When you're going into an enemy position to destroy something, you can chuck Mills bombs down the steps of a dugout and kill pretty much everybody in there. You can use them to clear the trenches that you're moving into, to gather a prisoner or intelligence papers. And then when big attacks take place, so battles like the Battle of the St. Loire Craters up at Ypres in March 1916, the use of bombers in that was a particularly important aspect of capturing mine craters. You could bomb your way up to the lip, round the lip, and take the German positions on the far side of the crater. And then when the Battle of the Somme began on the 1st of July and continued for the next 4.5 months, bombing sections, the use of grenades became really, really important in almost every attack that the British Army made during that summer, autumn and early winter of 1916. And that, of course, would continue for the rest of the war. Now, as we mentioned previously, it had been realised pretty early on in the fighting with the use of jam tin bombs that you could throw them a certain distance, but if you had a catapult, you could fire them even further. So taking the Mills grenade, they developed weapon systems that then could deliver that grenade to a much greater distance than a soldier could throw it. So rifle grenades became an important element of grenades that were used in trench warfare in the First World War. There was the Mills rifle grenade, that was a standard Mills bomb with a rod in the bottom, and that would go into a cup discharger. There were a couple of different types of those. One was just a kind of metal frame that went on the end of a Lee Enfield rifle, and then the grenade would slot it into that with the rod that would go down the barrel, and then the pin would be pulled so that the spoon would rest against the side of the cradle of the cup discharger, and then a blank round would be fired from the rifle, propelling the rifle grenade out of the end over the battlefield and landing on a target and exploding 5.5 seconds later. There was a later model of that as well, a much more solid grenade launcher, cup discharger, that was attached to the end of the Lee Enfield rifle. The grenade was placed in that, again with a rod that went down the barrel of the rifle, and then this could be used to fire at an angle and propel the grenade across the battlefields. And bombing sections then had rifle grenade men that would be used on the battlefield to support infantry attacks, to support sniper activity. That's something you commonly see with rifle grenade teams operating in conjunction with snipers who are sent forward to harass an enemy, and the rifle grenade team seem to act as close protection to them and also harass the enemy in a different way that the snipers were doing. But on the battlefield, in an infantry assault, it meant you were going forward with men that had these rifle grenades, that if you got to a point where a machine gun or a German rifle team was slowing you down, you could bring up the rifle grenade men and fire from a distance and hopefully suppress them, if not knock them out, and enable your advance to continue. And the importance of rifle grenades continued throughout the war, as they didn't just use Mills grenades as rifle grenades, they developed separate models, of which there is a whole range of these, and there are many books describing these rifle grenades, and again they are common objects found in the Iron Harvest on the battlefields even today, and of course should be respected and left alone because they were designed to kill, and even after a century they still can. But the use of catapults in that early stage of the conflict also made them think about using a similar type of weapon to propel the Mills grenade. So there were catapult devices that could fire these grenades across no man's land, but they also developed specific weapons. The spring gun was an example of that, which was basically a huge box of springs where you pulled a handle to tense all those springs together, and they tensed against the arm of the launcher with a kind of little hand that the grenade went into, and then you had a release lever which you flicked, all the springs were released, the arm went up, and it lobbed this grenade some incredible distance. Now, I'd only ever seen these in photographs until I went to a private museum near Vimy Ridge many years ago. I was put onto it by a friend who had another private museum near Arras, and this guy had found a spring gun in the remains of some trenches close to Vimy Ridge back in the 1960s, and for a long while he wasn't really sure what it was. He got it out of the ground, cleaned it up, and it was this big box of springs with some handles, but that's what it was. An incredible bit of device, very kind of Heath Robinson, to use that phrase of the time, where you've essentially got a whole collection of massive springs that are there designed for one purpose only, to throw a grenade across the battlefield. But they were only possible, they could only really be used when the front was very, very static. You couldn't pick up a spring gun and carry it across to the enemy positions. It had to be in a position where you were static and you were lobbing these grenades over a fairly short distance. So the advantage really in propelling a grenade across the battlefield came with the advent and the invention of cup dischargers, of grenade launchers that could be fired with rifles, enabling men to take that weapon onto the battlefield. And I think that if we consider trench warfare in the First World War, the grenade has to be one of the most decisive weapons of that trench warfare in terms of the effect that it can have on the battlefield. A group of men with a large supply of bombs could hold an enemy attack as they were coming down a trench towards them, and equally could turn the tide of battle by getting into an enemy position and bombing their way up that trench and taking the Germans on and pushing them back. I remember interviewing a couple of men from the Accrington POWs. They were one of the few POWs battalions at Sayre that got into the German trenches on the first day of the Battle of the Somme. And one of these veterans was a Lewis machine gunner, and he supported the bombers bombing their way up a communication trench towards Sayre village, which they got down towards the next German line. He gave covering fire while these men bombed their way down. But of course, very quickly they ran out of grenades. So like any part of the army during this conflict, these weapons are only as good as their supply. And if the supply runs out, then that weapon is no more and it can't affect the outcome of the action. So what you see as the war goes on is the development of grenade vests so that men can carry a large number of grenades with them. You also see water buckets being used to carry grenades onto the battlefield so that bombing teams can be resupplied with grenades very, very quickly. The Mills grenades came up in a wooden box with a tin that had the detonators in and the grenades either side and a little tool to unscrew the bottom of it. And all of this meant that this key weapon, this important weapon of trench warfare, was in the hands of British and Commonwealth soldiers fighting those battles in the trenches. And even in the last 100 days as the war went mobile, grenades did not lose their importance because they were still taking on static German defences. And even in those last few weeks when they were moving into woods and copses, and then more importantly villages where occasionally they were doing street fighting, grenades took on another importance in that kind of fighting in built-up areas. So grenades, our second important weapon of trench warfare. We move on to our third weapon of trench warfare, which is a weapon that definitely did not exist in the British Army in 1914, and that's the trench club. Trench clubs are these kind of gruesome handheld weapons, and I'll put a photograph that comes from the American National Archives that shows some examples of what these clubs look like. I'll put that onto the podcast website. These are weapons that were developed out of the experience of close quarters combat within trenches in the early phase of the First World War, particularly when soldiers were raiding the enemy. So the British Army didn't have these. They had an experience of coming across troops in the 19th century that carried clubs, and the common phrase that you see in the early phase of the war is not trench club to describe them, but knobkerrie, which I think is an African name for this type of club. And they were very basic things. In some cases, they were just entrenching tool handles. So the entrenching tools that soldiers carried were a two-part bit of kit. There was the blade, and then there was the handle that had a little metal helve on the top of it that dropped into the hole of the blade so that the two parts of the entrenching tool came together and you could use it. But if you discarded the blade and you just held the handle of the entrenching tool with this metal helve at the top of it, you could swing that like a club and you could whack people round the head and the face and use it as a weapon. So I suspect they were some of the very first trench clubs, in inverted commas, that were used. And then soldiers banged nails through those, and you see the extension of this with different designs of trench club being used and being designed and being locally made, probably on or just behind the battlefield. In some cases, they use what were called Indian clubs, which were things that were used for physical fitness training before the First World War, that were not much bigger than a rounder's bat, for example. And these could be used with nails or hobnails from boots attached to them to give them a kind of metal fixture, so that if you swung the wood and it's got a metal fixture on it and that comes into contact with a human being, it's going to cause a lot of damage. Now, these are not weapons that were designed to be used in combat going over the top into an attack in battle. They were specifically designed for trench raiding. And trench raiding is something that we're going to look at later on in this season of the podcast. But the trench club becomes a key weapon of that trench raiding, because the purpose of it, and it begins in that winter of 1914-15, is not to go over and beat up the enemy. You're going over to try and capture some of the enemy in most cases, to bring a prisoner back so he can be interrogated, so you can identify the unit that is opposite you and gather intelligence about enemy forces. And if you go over weapons, you're going to pull a trigger and you're going to shoot someone and either kill them instantly or badly wound them, and they're not going to be much use as a prisoner. But if you take over clubs with you, you can go over and you can beat the enemy round the head, you can knock them out, you can threaten them with these things, you can cause a bit of damage, and then drag them back as prisoners to your positions to be interrogated to get that information that you need from them. And the weapons as well, if you were going in with a trench raid at night, you would want to be going in with a degree of stealth. They didn't use that phrase in the First World War, but that's essentially what it was. And rather than go in with all guns blazing, it would be better if you were doing a quick operation where you're going in to snatch a prisoner, to go in there, use the trench clubs to attack an enemy that you have overcome with surprise, and then drag that prisoner back across no man's land before the shooting starts. That's the kind of idea. So that's when these improvised weapons begin to be used. And there appears to have been kind of semi-official factories behind the lines manufacturing these things. And what you see in some war diaries, in some units that occupy some parts of the front, they're described as trench stores. So they're not weapons that soldiers individually carry with them. They become part of the battalion's equipment, and in fact part of that trench sector equipment. So rather than one battalion own a collection of trench clubs, they leave them in a forward position. So when they go in the line, that equipment is there for them to use, and when they leave that part of the line, they leave it behind for the next unit coming in. And that use of what are called trench stores is not just confined to trench clubs, but all kinds of kit that was necessary for service in a forward position. But I think that trench clubs kind of reflect this idea of the First World War being this huge medieval siege war, because these are kind of medieval weapons. They're weapons of another age. This is the 20th century with poison gas and machine guns and later tanks and aircraft in the sky. But they're using a weapon, a trench club, a knobkerrie, that is no different than a weapon used 1,000 years before the First World War, let's say. But it's still effective. It can be used, as we've said, in that close quarter nature of some of the close quarter fighting in trenches, on raids, and can be used to good effect. And I remember many years ago as a kid going to the Imperial War Museum in the 1970s when they had a big display in the lower part of the main atrium of the Imperial War Museum in those days. And I think that kind of incarnation of the museum was called War, and it went from the First World War right up to the Vietnam War, I seem to recall. But I remember in the First War sections being particularly fascinated with the collection of trench clubs that they had on display, showing some pretty gruesome weapons with massive spikes and kind of metal gloves with blades coming out the front of them that you could go in and punch someone in the face and use the blade, the attached blade, to tear flesh apart. I mean, it's pretty awful, pretty gruesome stuff. But this was really the sharp end, quite literally the sharp end of the First World War, where this was not shooting a soldier in the distance or firing artillery to an unseen enemy. This was looking another man in the face as you went at him with a medieval-style club to either knock him out completely, put him out of the picture in terms of the fight, or to knock him out and drag him back across no man's land as a prisoner of war. So this was not a war-winning weapon, the trench club. It was not even a battle-winning weapon because it couldn't really be used in an attack. Men went over the top on the first day of the Somme, for example. They didn't have trench clubs hanging off their equipment. They were going to be useless in what they were about to do. They needed firearms, they needed bombs, they needed machine guns, they needed artillery support and trench mortars and everything else. But in terms of the totally static nature of the Western Front, with trench systems as there was on the Forgotten Front between Armentières and down towards Loos, long periods of static warfare where the front line did not move for a long period, in some cases years, then these types of weapons were really the cutting edge of what would be used when you took the enemy on in a raid or when they raided you. So trench clubs, another really important weapon of trench warfare in the Great War. Our fourth weapon of trench warfare is again another weapon that was not part of British Army stores in 1914, and that was the mortar, later the trench mortar. So the British Army went to war with artillery. It had field guns, it had the Royal Horse Artillery attached to cavalry units, the Royal Field Artillery and Infantry divisions, and the Royal Garrison Artillery with bigger guns. They did have some siege weapons, but mortars, as we think of them, were not part of British Army stores in 1914. Again, with this philosophy of a mobile war, this type of artillery had yet to be properly developed, and although mortars had existed in siege warfare in centuries past, or in warfare full stop in centuries past, most recently in the Russo-Japanese War, for example, just a decade before the First World War, they were not considered to be weapons that were suitable for a modern British army. So in the battles, again, of Mons and the Aisne and First Ypres, mortars are not part of the battlefield weaponry. But when the static war begins, that's when mortars, again, like grenades and like trench clubs, come into their own. It's quite clear that mortars are really important. And just like the German use of grenades highlighting the lack of grenades in the British Army, the Germans have a lot of trench mortars. They have mortars in 1914, the Minenwerfer, the small version that fires a small high-velocity shell, and then the larger version that fires a much bigger shell over a slower trajectory. Again, interviewing the veterans back in the 80s and 90s, they'd see these things being propelled up into the sky, this slow-moving large object being fired from a German Minenwerfer, or Mini as they called it, and it would come towards them and they'd run off down the trench to try and get away from it, and it would seem to change direction and follow them as if somehow it was magnetic to them. Now, that of course wasn't true, but that was what soldiers thought in the kind of heat of combat, that this thing was coming directly for them, and no matter where they ran, it would find them. But these weapons, when the Germans started to use them when the war went static, and they could destroy big chunks of trenches, cave-in dugouts or observation posts, machine gun positions, whatever it was quite clear that the Germans had a bit of an advantage there. So the British then bring up some early mortars that were used, not very effectively, very kind of ad hoc, and it wasn't until January 1915 when Sir Wilfrid Stokes designs the Stokes mortar, and that becomes one of the standard British trench mortars of the First World War. The Stokes mortar is essentially like a drain pipe with an open top and a closed end, and it fires a mortar bomb. At the bottom of that tube, if you like, is a spike. And the mortar bomb, the Stokes mortar round, it looks a bit like an exhaust. Again, these are often found amongst the iron harvest on the battlefields today, and once more should be left alone. It's ordnance, it can kill, and it's got to be treated with respect. But these Stokes rounds, they look a bit like a car exhaust. I remember the first time I saw one, I thought it was actually a car exhaust from a 2CV. But these Stokes mortars, they have a similar arrangement to a Mills hand grenade. So they have like a piston at the end with a spoon, a lever, and a pin. And what you do is, at the other end of the mortar is another protrusion with a blank cartridge in it and some explosive charges wrapped around it, which are the propellant, and you pull the pin out of the Stokes mortar, you slot it into the tube so that the lever, the spoon, is resting against the lip of the tube. You drop it and it slides down the tube, and then there's a spike at the bottom that hits the blank charge that then ignites the propellant and pushes the mortar out of the tube and propels it across the battlefield. And as soon as it exits the tube, the spoon, the lever flies off, and the timing mechanism begins, and the bomb explodes X number of seconds later. And a good crew, once they had one of these things set up, so the tube would be resting on a bipod, it would have a base plate to absorb the recoil when it fired. You could set this thing up pretty quickly, and you could fire 6 to 8 rounds before the first one landed on a target. And men had to be trained up on this weapon. They formed trench mortar batteries in infantry brigades. They called for volunteers to serve in these units, and they generally selected men with a greater level of intelligence and ability who could think for themselves and not hang around to be given orders to do a particular task. And the TOC-emmers, using the signalling phonetics of the time, T was TOC, M was MEM, and the TMs, the trench mortars, became known as the TOC-emmers. They were highly proficient, highly successful, but not highly regarded units within the British Army, because the infantry knew when trench mortar guys turned up, fired off a barrage in a trench, they'd pack up their gear and go away, and by the time they left, the enemy would retaliate and lob their own trench mortars or artillery onto your position in retaliation. So the development of Stokes of that very basic drainpipe style weapon in 1915 led to an explosion of the use of mortars, excuse the pun, right across the battlefield, and not just in the static nature of trench warfare, because obviously within trench warfare in a static position you could use these to harass the enemy and to knock out key targets, but mortars were portable. This type of mortar, the Stokes mortar, was a portable weapon. So we've used the first day of the Somme as a good example to talk about some of these weapons, and on the first day of the Somme, in many attacks along that Somme front on the 1st of July 1916, mortars went over the top into no man's land to accompany the infantry assaults. That famous set of photographs and film taken in the sunken lane at Beaumont Hamel doesn't just include the Lancashire Fusiliers, it includes machine gunners from the Brigade Machine Gun Company and trench mortar men from the Brigade Trench Mortar Battery as well. So the portable nature of the weapon made it ideal for trench warfare, made it ideal to react to the static nature of trench warfare, but also made it a weapon that could be adapted to the attack, to the advance, because the British philosophy was not to stay in these trenches indefinitely, was to one day advance, push the enemy back, and this weapon could be used in that task as well. And it remained an absolutely essential part of infantry tactics and brigade level actions, with multiple battalions going into action supported by Stokes mortars for the rest of the First World War. It's probably one of the most underrated but yet important weapons of the Great War, not just of trench warfare but the whole conflict itself. And that style of mortar became commonly adapted by everyone by the outbreak of the Second World War. And if you look at actions in World War II, once you get to Normandy, the vast majority of infantry casualties in places like Normandy were caused by mortars. The Allies firing mortars at the Germans, and the Germans lobbing their mortars back at us. And that's true from D-Day right through the rest of the campaign. But this was the kind of nucleus of this kind of weaponry and its implementation in warfare. From the much bigger examples, the Minenwerfers used by the Germans, it was quite large, clumsy weapons. Quite a few of the French ones were very similar. In the early stage of the conflict, they changed their designs as well. But the Stokes was probably one of the best mortars, which is why essentially that design was then copied by everyone else further down the line. But the Stokes mortar was only one part of the story from the British and Commonwealth perspective, because it wasn't just the British Army that used the Stokes. Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, they were all issued with this weapon. So it became part of the British Expeditionary Force weaponry for the rest of the conflict. But it wasn't just the brigade level trench mortar batteries that were important. As the war went on, it was realised that larger trench mortars were needed. These weren't as portable, but they could be used to good effect. They had a greater range because they had much bigger projectiles in them. And what you see then is the development of heavy mortars that were then used at divisional level. So the Stokes were used to support battalions within a brigade. The heavy mortars were part of the firepower of the entire division. So they sat alongside the Royal Field Artillery, field guns and howitzers that they had. So two in particular from the heavy mortar perspective was the 6-inch Newton mortar and the 9.45-inch mortar, which was often referred to as the Flying Pig, which was this large 9.45-inch bomb with large fins behind it that could be thrown over a big distance. And these were used to knock out strong points, to knock out specific targets, to assist in infantry assaults across no man's land. They were used in a support role in the advance on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, for example, and many other attacks during the war. And in static positions, they could be used to seriously damage the enemy positions, because one of those flying pigs, when it went over, when it exploded, absolutely massive explosion and a huge amount of damage. So again, they proved particularly useful. Now, the Stokes mortars operated at brigade level were manned by infantry or former infantry soldiers. The heavy trench mortars, the Newton mortar and the Flying Pig, they were operated by the Royal Garrison Artillery. So this was kind of a different branch of the trench mortars. There was no such thing as a trench mortar corps or a trench mortar regiment in the British Army. It was made up of the lighter mortar, the Stokes, being operated at the infantry level by former infantry soldiers who were now part of a brigade trench mortar battery, and then the heavy mortars operated by men from the Royal Artillery. And together, this cacophony of firepower from the light mortars, the Stokes mortars, through to the heavy mortars of 6-inch and 9.45-inch, they could be used with incredible effect by the British Army in defending its positions in the static parts of the Western Front, but also supporting its men as they went into battle in those great campaigns and those great offensives of the second half of the First World War. So mortars, a weapon not really on the radar of British troops in 1914, becomes an essential part of its armament by 1918 and would remain so from that day since. The British Army today, mortars are an essential part of any infantry unit on the battlefield, even more than a century after the Great War. And to finish our look at 5 weapons of trench warfare, our 5th one is the kind of curveball. The 5th one is a shovel, and by a shovel I would also include an entrenching tool. Now you're sitting there at home now or in your car and you're saying to me, that's not a weapon, it's a tool. Well, it is, but it became both. Shovels, entrenching tools could be used in weapons in the same way that trench clubs could be used. If the enemy got into your positions, you could use a piece of equipment like that as a weapon to beat back the enemy. And there are many examples of entrenching tools being used in close quarter combat in the First World War, and shovels, the much bigger kind of spades that were used by tunnellers or men working in those kind of conditions, could also be used in combat when an enemy mining group got into a British tunnel system and there was fighting beneath ground. But that's not what we're really talking about here. We've looked at weapons that could be used to shoot an enemy with a handgun, to blow an enemy up with grenades and trench mortars, to club an enemy to death with trench clubs. This is different altogether. It's not a weapon that can be used to take the enemy on, but it's a piece of kit that the soldier needs to survive in the elements of trench warfare. Trench warfare, that troglodyte world, was about digging in. And to dig in, you couldn't dig in with a bayonet, you couldn't dig in with a bomb or a trench mortar or a trench club. You needed an entrenching tool, or even better, a shovel. And the army went to war in 1914 wearing 1908 pattern webbing equipment, which had a little pouch at the back that had the blade of the entrenching tool and attached to the frog of the bayonet, with the scabbard of the bayonet, was the entrenching tool handle. And that could be pulled out of that piece of webbing. The blade could be taken out of its little pouch, and you've got an entrenching tool to dig a little shell scrape to dig yourself in under fire. And it's amazing how quickly men can dig in when they are under fire. You're not going to dig a trench system with an entrenching tool, and you're certainly not going to dig a tunnel system with an entrenching tool. That's why you need a shovel. And every infantry battalion in 1914 would have had a supply of shovels, but as the war went on, the number of shovels available to units, again often being used as trench stores, being left behind for units going in and out of the line, that would increase dramatically, because the whole nature of trench warfare was about building and rebuilding, and the shovel becomes the weapon of construction. And that weapon is incredibly important if your purpose of trench warfare is to protect your men. To protect them, you need to dig in, and you need to dig deep, and you need entrenching tools, and you need shovels to do that. And even in attacks, so in a static period of trench warfare, that's essential, but even in an attack, you need the same. So again, we'll go back to our look at the first day of the Battle of the Somme. In many battalions, every man that went over the top had a pick or a shovel down the back of his equipment, mainly a shovel, because they needed that shovel when they got to an enemy position. If they captured that trench, they needed to reverse that trench, so take the parapet that was now facing towards their lines, knock that down, and then build a new parapet at what was the parados, the back of the trench, to reverse that trench for defence. So if they took it and captured it, they need to defend it, and they need a new parapet, and it would need the construction perhaps of a communication trench from that captured frontline German position back to their old front line, and connect up those two positions so that more men can come forward and continue with the battle. So the more you look at the static nature of trench warfare and the battles of the First World War, the soldiers have a huge amount of weapons, often modern weapons, but the humble, bog-standard shovel becomes just as important as the rifle or the bayonet or the bomb, because without the shovel, without the entrenching tool, that soldier cannot dig in. He cannot protect himself in the confines of trench warfare. He cannot expand upon his defences to protect him against enemy attacks trying to break that trench warfare. And in battle, he needs that shovel to move forward and dig in under fire if required. It's absolutely essential. Perhaps out of all of these 5 elements of trench warfare weaponry that we've looked at, the shovel is perhaps one of the most important, but not considered, of course, a weapon within its own right. And today, like the other weapons that we've discussed in this podcast, which you'll find amongst the iron harvest on the battlefields more than a century later, and you'll see in the museums across that landscape of the Western Front, the shovel is perhaps just walk straight by. If you go there, you look at the machine guns, and you look at the barbed wire pickets, and you look at the trench clubs, and you look at the bayonets and the pistols, everything else, but you'll walk straight past the shovels. But yet those shovels are amongst perhaps the most important bits of kit on the battlefields of the Great War. And again, more than a century later, with trench warfare in Ukraine, they remain an incredibly important piece of kit. Soldiers are fighters, are warriors, but at times they're labourers too. And the weapon of the labourer is the shovel and the entrenching tool. And I think it helped define what trench warfare became and would become during those 4 years of the Great War. So as we've looked at these 5 weapons of trench warfare, we can see that these weapons are in many ways both simultaneously defined by and also defined trench warfare. The kind of one led into another as soldiers prepared for a mobile war found themselves in the midst of the most static conflict in history. The weapons we've discussed demonstrate how armies could and had to adapt in the conditions of this trench warfare, and how industry played such an important role in modern warfare, not only helping to build these new weapons and pieces of equipment, but supply them in vast quantities and also supply the ammunition that some of them required in vast quantities as well, or the spare parts needed to keep them functioning. This idea of the Great War being an industrial war, with everything happening on an industrial scale and supply on an industrial scale, resulting in killing on an industrial scale, is greatly apparent when we look at the weapons of trench warfare. For the men who were there, and Leslie Lovegrove, who we discussed, was one of them, how they viewed these weapons, I think, helped define their own experience of that conflict. For him, it wasn't the revolver that he couldn't fire or a grenade that he probably couldn't throw, but it was the shovel, a shovel that he bought, an identical one that he'd had in the trenches that he bought from an army surplus store that he used on his small holding. And when he turned the soil on his allotment with that shovel, identical to those that he'd had in France and that he dug positions on the Hindenburg line with, he found his mind was back there again, back on that landscape of the Great War. So perhaps the shovel that we've discussed just at the end was the very pinnacle of these trench warfare weapons. And now, as the season turns, as we move towards the autumn, and the French farmers approach this time and deep plough those fields and that landscape of the First World War, the battlefronts once more give up their secrets. The fragments of these trench weapons, they too form part of that iron harvest that we see at this time of year. And like hidden treasure from an ancient world, they too mark those criss-cross paths that we find always along the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.